I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zeiss Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello,
Hi,
everyone.
everybody.
Welcome to Arcane Mark. Today we are talking about prep work, do's and don'ts. We recently talked about what next after improvising, but what if you didn't improvise? What if you wanted to do some prep work?
So, one of the first things to keep in mind with prep work is that the amount of focus that you want to put on different areas of your prep is going to be a personal decision based on which areas you find are easiest to improvise on the fly. If you're a GM who, if your players decide that they want to walk into a town, you have an easy time coming up with new NPCs with vibrant personalities and motivations and names and just generating them on the fly and creating that kind of content, then you might not need to spend as much time in that kind of area of prep. Conversely, if you're a GM who is very comfortable with, say, cracking open the whatever the monster building mechanics are and coming up with a new monster on the fly, or just saying, oh yeah, I think I have an encyclopedic knowledge of the bestiaries, I can just say, yes, I want to build this encounter, and boom, there you go. And I'm gonna just pull out a map real quick. Then maybe you don't need to spend as much time on the prep for the encounter. So the amount that you want to use each of these tool sets is going to depend on your experiences.
Now, while it's a highly personal decision and it's going to be a personalized process, there are some do's and don'ts and tips that we have that are true no matter what. And I want to start with some of those universal tips. I'm going to start with Ray Winnegar's first rule of dungeon craft from Dungeon Magazine, which is do not create more than what you need or probably need. Don't create something you know you don't need, in other words. So when you're creating content in your prep work, if you go to a level of detail that you're guaranteed will never matter because it's only for you. I mean, you can if it's just for fun or to be calming or just like an activity you're doing for you.
Or like
but don't
you're trying to publish
game.
A setting and you think other people might have different things that they grab onto. But
for the game, that's the last thing you should do. First, come up with what you absolutely need. Then you go with the things that you think you probably need. And the last thing you should do, if at all, is something that you know you definitely don't need.
Yeah, so if your PCs are just going to be stopping over briefly in a location, you don't need to know everything about, like, that location's culture and social structure and, like, what the mother's maiden name is of the person who runs the general store. Like, you don't need that kind of details. What you want to have are enough details to give a location personality, but you don't need everything else.
That's right. So you want enough so that you can handle what you know you need to handle, and you can handle what you probably will need to handle. And yeah, sure, some of that might not come to use. That's okay. You don't have to railroad people into exactly what your prep is. But it should be something that they probably will need, based either on the expected adventure or your PC's demeanor. Like, if you know that they're going to commit a crime, then it pays to know how long the guard will take to get there. Maybe the personality name of the captain of the guard, and maybe a quest the captain of the guard can ask them to do to try to clear their name or something like that. And that leads me to the other side of the first rule of Dungeon Craft. I talk about the first rule of Dungeon Craft a decent amount of time. But the other side of it is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The PCs are walking disasters, let's be clear. And with disasters, prevention is much easier than relief. Even though nobody wants to pay for prevention, and they always just send in relief afterwards. But you are someone who knows for a fact that a natural disaster is coming to your best laid plans, aka the PCs. So you can afford prevention. And so you don't want to take the first rule of Dungeon Craft too far and use it to not even try to prevent, being like, well, I can't be positive I'll use any of things, so therefore I'll use nothing and I won't prepare a thing. If you have expectations of what your PCs are likely to do, knowing their personalities, talking to them in session 0, knowing their motivations, obviously they're going to do something you never predicted sometimes. But if you have a good sense of the way that they're disruptive, you can try to come up with some kind of prevention, or at least like a rapid response team thing that you can do.
Yeah. So, like, if your group is one that when it comes time to go into town to sell stuff, it's just like, we sell stuff, okay, we're back out and doing adventures. Then, you know, you don't need to, it's not worth fleshing out a lot about that town. But if your group is one that every time they go to a new place, they're always, you know, going to canvass the area for rumors about strange supernatural happenings, then having strange supernatural happenings or information about them ready in every new location they go is going to be worth your time.
That's right. If that's just what that PC always does. Or let's say you are expecting the unexpected. You have one PC who's a ruffian, is always going to make some trouble, but you never know if it's going to be they just like release a badger into the bathhouse. Like, I don't know. That you couldn't have predicted that's exactly what they would do. You still might be able to come up with like a floating response that you could do to whatever their mischief is that you can adjust slightly and then deploy it quickly.
Yeah, so you can be like, okay, you know, I have this stat. These stats represent like guards or mercenaries or other combat capable people who will respond to disturbance, and I have these stats to represent like an angry mob that might form if the PCs cause issues in a way that might form an angry mob.
Yep.
And I have like this, or I have like this plan for like a basic social skill challenge that can happen if the PCs severely offend people by blaspheming against the major deity of this religious settlement.
That's right.
What have you.
And so maybe you thought that the player who's always doing some shenanigans was going to blaspheme against the deity, and so you created this angry religious puritanical mob, and instead he released a badger into the bathhouse. So then you, on the fly, you release that mob, but you put down their AC by 1, and now they are naked, previously just bathing.
Yes.
Puritanical angry mob.
Yes.
It's even more angry because you made them go out naked with a bathrobe when they don't like to do that because they're puritanical. And so they have 1 lower AC, but they're enraged and deal additional damage because of how mad you made them be to get them to mob up from the bathhouse.
Yeah, so that's another thing that's useful in prep work, is that if you're preparing things, rather than saying, like, this is the stat block that is definitively only for this one specific purpose, if you can consider, like, a range of ways that you might be able to put that to use depending upon what the PCs do, then that'll help you out with being flexible during the session.
Alright, yeah, Dalek Reject said being chased by a naked puritanical crowd is a classic tabletop RPG moment.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. That's definitely the kind of thing that's like, that's probably not going to happen in the CRPG or JRPG you're playing, but in a tabletop RPG?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, classic. So, there's an example of where you, like, I just came up with it here, but, like, you never would have guessed exactly that they were going to release a badger into the bathhouse, but you can still be prepared for something.
And that doesn't even necessarily mean that you have to come up with the angry mob stat block in advance. You could, for example, say, okay, I found a good angry mob stat block that's a troop on Archives of Nethys. So, like, I can plan to take that and then make these couple of adjustments to make them into my angry mob. And then that's going to be my plan. And so my notes say, guard troop, but then they give a few variations. It's like, okay, these people don't have halberds. Instead, they have clubs. And, like,
right.
You've changed up a few things about them.
So there's another possibility, too. So this was assuming you knew this guy was going to play some prank or do something that was going to get him in trouble with the law or an angry mob. Maybe they're just so unpredictable, you literally don't know what he's going to do, and it could be highly disruptive or not, and you don't know how to respond. But here's the thing. It doesn't have to be a directly responsive little piece that you create in preparation. So let's say, for example, that there were, like, secret evil cults to, like, the stars and the things from the great beyond that were summoning aberrations. And so, that were in this town. And they just are. That's part of the secrets of the town. But because of that, there's some flumps farting away through the atmosphere, looking around to try to protect people from the aberration, because that's the deal with flumps. And so you just have a plan that whenever something weird happens and you're not sure what to do next, a bunch of flumps just kind of fall down out of the sky and fall on
Hey,
the
guys.
PCs. Hey guys, do you know where the aberrations are? And that just happens. And that could literally happen at any time, as long as you're outdoors.
Yeah.
Like,
and something like that also doesn't even have to be in the next session, which goes into another part of prep work, which is, if you know that a PC is likely to cause a disruption and, chase up an angry mob or whatever, you don't know what session it's going to be in. You can just have, like, okay, I have an angry mob that's ready for these kinds of things. You have, like, a set of events that are ready that you can plop out. And, if it turns out that the PC's leveled up before you had a chance to run that event, then it's a lot easier to go in and bump the numbers by a little bit than it is to come up with something from scratch.
There you go. So, basically, when it comes to the only universal things mostly to say are for prep work, which sounds almost a little obvious when you condense it down to its fundamental form of the first rule of dungeon craft and not going too far in that, is don't do too much prep work, but also do enough prep work.
Yeah. Well, we're talking some about, like, sort of stats and encounter type things here. So why don't we stay on this topic for a bit?
Sure.
So another thing that you're gonna get with encounters as well is maps and is like maps and art of creatures. These are kinds of things where, like, if you're a GM who relies heavily on maps, having some of that stuff in advance can be very useful. Rather than having to kind of, like, sketch it out or draw it out on the fly. Or, like, even if you're like, I have a library of maps, collecting some that you think, taking out some that you think might be useful.
Absolutely.
So that you know kind of what you're doing. Having a sense of, even if you don't know exactly what you want to do and you are the kind of person who sketches things out on the fly, having a sense of what you want to do with the space as a whole, like, how big do you want this region to be? How wide are its hallways? Like, how large are the rooms that you're in, and what are the major locations that you wanted to have, to make sure that you don't, like, write yourself into a corner where you forgot to add something important, or, like, oops, I made a connection back to this room. They totally should have done this.
That's right.
So even if you don't want to draw out a full map in advance, I'd recommend doing, like, a little ball and stick map, where you draw, like, a circles and lines to show how vague important areas connect.
A ball and stick map is a good example of the kind of thing that very few people can get away with literally not having any amount of map for a decently sized dungeon area. Even if you have some vague ideas for the encounters. Now, some people can, especially if you run a game that's more narrative, and so the actual connection of the rooms don't matter very much, because whichever way they go, you're going to describe some kind of cool thing that's in a room. You'll be just like, you make some turns and you go through the dungeon, and then you hear an ominous growling sound, and then you get them into the encounter. If you kind of hand wave the dungeon, which some systems do, in fact, that's one of the potential default modes of running a dungeon in Fabula Ultima, an RPG that's kind of more on the narrative side for outside of combat, but also, like, it's for JRPGs that you do have giant dungeons, so they do let you do a grid map of, like, the whole dungeon if you want to, but they also suggest maybe it's just narrative and you just describe that they went through it and then you get to the next fight. So that is a way to do it, but otherwise, like Linda said, almost no matter what, you probably need a little bit of something to help you. Now, let's say you don't know for sure where the PCs are going, but you still are not the kind of person who could just make up maps in the middle of the session. You could create a ball and stick that looks interesting to you and have no idea what the balls and sticks are leading to at first until you find out, oh, okay, it seems like this guy got arrested for putting badgers in the bathhouse, and now I need the jail. Okay, this ball and stick that I drew before is a jail, a very unusual jail. Why is it connected in this way? Well, maybe it was a jail that was an independent corporation that was a for-profit jail, and they made it out of an old building that was like really weird and does not look like a normal jail.
Yeah,
and, that's why
and maybe you
that.
put like a few basic things on that map where you're like, okay, you know, this is a room that's kind of like a boss encounter room or like a mini boss encounter room, and over here there's a treasure or something like that. If you wanted to like try to do certain things for the structure and flow, but you don't know like what they are specifically.
Right. You can figure it out later, potentially. So the key of prep and of fitting your own jamming idiom is figure out what is the thing that is your Achilles heel and prep a lot of that. For example, I am generally pretty good at improvising. And, you know, Linda started out by just prepping or over prepping everything.
Yes.
Now she's gotten a lot better at improvising, but names are still one of her weaknesses.
Correct.
So Linda
I generate names.
A name bank.
Yes.
And does she know where they're going to go? No, but it's
No.
like 40 or 50 names. And then she's like, oh, well, of these names, this NPC sort of doesn't sound like a Draxathon. It's more like a Leonaris. So
Yeah.
I'll pick Leonaris and not Draxathon for this one.
Yes, exactly. So having names pre-available. Another thing you can do this for if you have prepping for if you have a lot of players are pretty visual, so like art of NPCs.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you don't know exactly who that art's gonna go to, but you're just like, oh yeah, you know, I have a bank of art pieces that look like they could be like people who generally are from this area.
That one could be Draxathon.
It's like Draxathon says this or whatever, and then you just pull things out of your bank, and in your notes you say, okay, yeah, that's Draxathon.
Mm-hmm. And Garland suggests challenging yourself by purposely putting something that you feel you're weak on to try to improve at it. I think that's a good idea, that you can include things that you're weak on to try to improve on it, but there's not necessarily a need to put yourself on the spot to generate something that you're weak on. That's kind of the difference. Or if you do, you might give yourself that challenge not during the session. So, for example, you might be like, okay, this is not the session. I'm just like in my room by myself.
Mm-hmm.
I have 30 minutes to do a name jam. I'm going to write as many names as I can for my name bank for the session. That's your challenge. But the challenge doesn't have to be, okay, my players are all here. They're waiting for my NPC, and now I challenge myself to come up with a name quickly. That's really putting you on the spot, and your players are also sort of part of your guinea pigs for that challenge, whereas the one that I suggested, they aren't.
Yeah, so, like, for example, if you're someone who's like, yeah, you know, well, I feel very comfortable with combats, but, like, heists are more difficult, and I want to do a heist session, then that's a good sign that that's a session where a lot of prep work would be good.
Yes. And when the players are like, how did you prepare for this thing that we're doing? Then you say, I'm glad you asked. And then you do a flashback scene to a few days before the session when you were preparing for the heist and you came up with this great idea that you could then use to help run the heist.
Yeah, Kojo, exactly. The more you GM, the better you get at prepping. I think that, you know, like, defaulting toward doing more prep when you're not really sure what you're gonna need is probably better than defaulting to do less, and then you learn what you don't need and find ways to reuse what you prep that you didn't.
So I
only
need. Partially agree with that, and this is actually sort of my philosophy, not just on prep work, but also on studying. Which is, if you can have a group of people who are very understanding that it's your first game. I would say this is the equivalent of, like, at MIT, your first semester is pass or no record on classes. You cannot, like, I didn't do a great job at following my own advice because I got all A's and they became passes, but you cannot actually get an A at MIT in your first semester unless they changed it since we were there. You can only either pass or there's no record you even took the class if you didn't. So my contention was that it would be foolish to try your absolute hardest during that time. Because if you try your absolute hardest, you probably will get an A in everything, and you put, like, tons and tons and tons of hours into it. But if you instead try to do it at, like, a comfortable pace for you that's not killing you, and see what you get, and it's a C or a B, or in my case it was also an A, then you know you don't have to put in more effort than that later on.
Yeah,
and
see,
you've
well,
learned
this
it out.
is a difference in our philosophies, right? Because I approach it from the perspective of like, you know, this is gonna be hard, and I want to put my all into it, but I'll know that I have some slack or leeway if I trip and fall, but I want to challenge myself to do the best that I can.
So, like, for me, I wanted to figure out what is the right amount of effort to put into it because you can always study more and you can always prep more.
And I feel the same way about prep too. It's like, you know, but I think, you know, this also comes into sort of like different ways that we think about things, right? Because I am naturally a very anxious person. So for me, if I feel like I have fully prepared as much as I can, then I feel better about it. And then I'm like, well, you know, I'd rather be too prepared than not prepared enough. So it took me a long time to learn to do less in the prep department and to trust myself to improvise and things like that. But for me,
you know, I think it would have taken me a long time if I prepped a lot at first.
Yeah, but for me, like if I hadn't prepped that much to start with, and then, you know, I credit the amount of prep that I initially did to how well some of those things went when I in my early time of DMing and the confidence that I was able to build. So I think that, you know, it's, you know, our two different experiences show that it isn't a one size fits all type thing.
Yes.
It's
obviously,
like,
it would be
based on your
it would be
personality.
ideal if you somehow psychically knew what the exact correct amount of prep was and then did that amount of prep.
Mm-hmm.
I feel that even if your personality is such that you feel safer having done more prep, if you have a safety blanket and a safety net, very specifically, it's not like new players you've never met. Obviously, everyone's going to want to do the extra prep, but it's like you already know them, you've played with them before, this is your first time GMing, they want to help you GM, and they're here to help, and at least one of them is your usual GM, and all of those things, such that you have that kind of safety net, that you may, I think it's better to have slightly under, so that you can see if that's okay. So you can see if that's okay, and then if you figure out that you needed more,
I think it's a matter of I think it's a matter of knowing your own personality in that case. Like, how do you generally approach challenges?
I guess the question to me is this: which one is worse for you? And the answer legitimately could be either one.
Mm-hmm.
The anxiety of potentially having one session that was under prepped and then always prepping correctly in all the times after that, or always over prepping for a very long time until you, after a very, very long time, slowly figure out what the correct amount of it is. What do you mean?
Because I think what I was recommending is that you start at whatever higher level you feel comfortable with, and then you can taper back in the ones that as you gain experience.
Well, I think it's harder to taper back because you don't know how much of what you did you needed to do as easily. Because if you do X and then X works, it's hard sometimes. Maybe just for me, but for a lot of people I've talked to, it's hard to know which of the things that you did you didn't need unless they were literally useless.
Here's the thing, though. That could be true in an environment where it was possible to prepare for everything that PCs could possibly do. But in the experience of GMing for a tabletop RPG, there's, no matter how well you prep, there's going to be things that throw you for a loop and surprise you. So you can still learn from that what parts you are most comfortable with improvising and what parts you're not as comfortable with improvising, and then adjust your style there, because you still have a way to get that information and adapt accordingly.
I mean, that's certainly true that you'll know which parts that you're more comfortable with improvising or not. And I'm certainly not saying that you should ever leave a particular aspect which you've never explored or jammed before, being like, I've decided randomly to leave names completely unprepared in my first game. I have no idea if I'm good at generating names or bad at generating names. Names I've just decided not to do. I'm just saying, if you have a rough guess of what you think you need, and you do just a little bit less, but still do something in every category, and just see, it might turn out that you were okay with that amount less.
I think we're going to have to agree to disagree.
Yeah, I think we will. That's okay. Linda and I have very similar styles on almost all of these episodes. And this is more like in Roll for Combat Live, where Steven and I disagree on like half the topics.
Yep.
And I think it's more valuable to get two people who disagree that to get two people
I
who
think
agree.
so too. I think so too. So like I was saying before, I think the point is that like based on whichever of us sounded like was making more sense, you should probably do what that person suggested.
Yes, based on which of us you were like, Mark, what were you even thinking? That
or like Linda,
your
you're
logic,
way too risk
your
averse.
logic made no sense, Mark. Why would I not just prepare? I don't mind if
Mm-hmm.
I've spent a lot more hours preparing. I'll never have a session where I wasn't prepared. In your way, I will almost guarantee that I have a high chance to have one where I wasn't prepared enough. And yeah, if you're like, if you're another sense, Linda, that's too risk averse. I don't want to spend dozens of extra hours on these things. I'm okay if I have one session that was
If
not
you're
quite
like,
prepared.
yeah, if you're like, oh my gosh, like if or like, oh my gosh, if I'm not prepared, I'm not going to. If I'm not prepared enough, then I will actively dislike the session because I'll be so stressed out. Or in order to enjoy things, I need to make sure that I'm amply prepared. What are you talking about, Mark? Versus like, why would you do that? Or you're just having fun anyway? Like,
oh no, for me, I'd actually rather actively dislike. If I could have a situation where in one scenario I did 40 hours of prep work and I liked all of the sessions, and in one scenario I did 20 hours of prep work for, let's say it was a 10 session campaign, either way, and I disliked the first session because I felt like I didn't prepare enough and I didn't have fun as much as I should have had. I actually didn't like it that much. I'd much rather spend 20 hours and dislike the first session because I saved 20 hours of prep work from calibrating correctly on the amount of prep work. So I think that's the reason that we're different, is because I place so much value on knowing and calculating what the correct minimum amount of prep work that I need to do is to follow the first rule of Dungeon Craft. I place it above my own comfort. It's not that my comfort is not impacted by it.
Whereas for me, like I would consider that time leading up to the session, right? Like if I didn't prep enough, I would be experiencing significant anxiety, like in the days or potentially even week beforehand, when I was first starting out. So like I enjoy much better whenever I'm prepped, and then I'll enjoy the session, and then I'm not going to be thinking afterwards like, oh, did I do a bad job? Did I let my friends down because I didn't do well enough?
Right. And I mean, if I was having an anxiety spike that could only be satisfied by prepping, which, to be clear, is the kind of thing that like roughly could happen to me in some situations. If I feel like something bad is happening, I get like a feeling that I have to do something. And then I can't, like, people saw me on Twitter that one time, like, early on, right before the Union, where I did a thread about, like, every person who was at Paizo.
Yeah, and I was like...
And Linda's like, come to sleep, it's 3 a.m. I was like, I can't, I didn't finish putting down every person who was at Paizo on there. So, like, look, I get it.
Yeah.
If my brain was triggered and I was like, no, I cannot go to sleep, I have not done my prep work.
Yep.
I would do it. But otherwise, to me, it's very valuable to not do the extra prep work.
Yeah, Coach was talking about, like, if you don't need it, you can probably use it later. Yeah.
Potentially.
And sometimes you can't.
The thing about it is, when you're doing the extra prep work, the prep work I'm imagining is prep work that it wasn't even useless. Because if it was useless, then you actually know that you didn't need to do it. It's prep work that, like, yeah, you kind of did use it, but you didn't really have to make it, because even at the point where you had gone halfway but covered all of your bases, but, like, let's say it was more of a black and white, like, line drawing, and then you painted it like a full-on watercolor with mixing the colors and all of these canvas, and it was like, but with the black and white line drawing, you knew what it was and probably, let's say, could have run it completely fine. But yet, if you run it with the watercolors, you're going to notice that you had the watercolors, and you're going to be like, no, I used those watercolors. They were in there. That's why it's not so easy to be like, I immediately know what I didn't need and can now tamp down to the line drawing next session, because... in fact, you will probably feel good about the watercolors.
Yeah, but it also, I mean, and that's part of it too, right? Like, if you're someone who, some people might be like, what's the point of having like maps and art and like these other things in the session, because you're only going to have them up for a short period of time, and like that's not the main focus, and folks aren't going to remember those details. Or you might be someone who's like, going to go full out on the music and the ambiance and the art and like the and handouts and everything else like that. Like, it's also depending, and part of that I think comes to like, what does the GM enjoy and what does the table really appreciate and feel that contributes to their experience.
That part is really important because we talked about your comfortableness and we talked about where you were at, but your table matters a lot. And when you combine yourself with your table, sometimes you wind up with a GM who isn't even following their own advice, like me. I just got done talking about how you shouldn't do too much prep work and try to do less prep work than you think that you need to do. But I haven't started running my Strength of Thousands game that people built their characters for months and months ago. Because when I discovered that by checking carefully in the adventure path that there's only enough actual events that happen such that you either need to have many years where just nothing happens, or just be like, yeah, the students all graduated through multiple stages of class and are now professors in like a year or maybe 2 at most. And I was like, I can't do that. I need to now prep to expand Strength of Thousands and add a ton of more events and other subsystems that I'm going to design myself.
Yeah.
This has taken months and I've not started
but
the campaign.
But then you take a step back and it's like, okay, why did you do that? Well, I don't think you would have done that if when you vastly expanded social things in Jade Regent, our home group was like, meh. Because our home group instead was like, oh, this is cool. We want to engage with this. We want to do this kind of thing. And so, like, you're doing that because you know that that's something that our group likes.
Yep. I knew our group, and that's why I did it. I knew our group would also be, which included, like, it has multiple physics PhDs, some of whom are, like, actual professors. Mm-hmm. Okay? And I knew that they would not be thrilled with the idea that their characters somehow, like, were going to school and then went from, like, undergrad to grad to postdoc to being a professor in, like, 4 months, given their own life experience of how hard that was for them. Yes. I think that they would have wanted to have the experience take longer amount of time, even if that means it takes me, like, an extra year to create all of this, like, additional content so I can fill it up and make it feel like multiple years were really happening for them, and run it on, like, a very slow XP track or something like that. And
or even
it
Milestone.
Just depends on the group.
I could see using Milestone for that campaign, honestly.
Yes, Milestone could work because it may have too much stuff to be anything except Milestone. And Garland says, know yourself, know your table, cannot be underestimated in value. Yeah, I mean, it's an analogy of Sun Tzu, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, you must know your enemy and also know yourself.
Yeah, and in terms of, like, well, let's just, we keep talking about, like, well, if you know your table, how do you get to know what your table likes? I'd recommend trying a bunch of different things and see how the group responds to them.
Yes, if they make snarky comments on similar things, which my group definitely has, then you know that they might want you to not.
What kind of sessions are they super into? And when you put the extra work into prepping, like, music or, like, art or other things like that, are they just like, yeah, whatever? Do they really seem to appreciate it? And that'll tell you, hey, this is the kind of thing that they want to see more of. Are they really invested in sessions that have, like, heists or bigger social scenes or things like that? Or do you have several players who go take out their phone whenever they're not getting to beat something up?
Yep. So another important secret of prep work that we've kind of alluded to here with, like, the mob that you can use again is no matter how strangely detailed or specific something is that you prepared and you thought you were going to use and the PCs absolutely went somewhere else, there's usually a small amount of work you could do to then use it again somewhere else. Mm-hmm. Even if it's this hyper-specific dungeon related to this evil organization you created that the PCs decided they either didn't care about or allied with that organization, you can still figure out how to use it. From as close to the original use as, yeah, okay, they allied with the evil organization, that's great. But one of the lieutenants within that evil organization doesn't like these up-and-coming new PCs, and their base, which happens to be exactly the one you were going to have them fight, and that person... Yes. Now is in a turf war with the PCs, and they have to go into this dungeon so they can be the boss of this region under the evil overlords of the evil organization.
Yeah.
You can use it as close to the original as that, or just like, okay, you can go the next step out, which is well, you're with our organization, but we have a rival evil organization that's doing the same thing. Go to their dungeon and mess them up. And then it turns out it was the same dungeon that you were going to throw them into.
Yeah, but like as long as they didn't literally explore the dungeon, I mean, the general rule of until the PCs see it, it doesn't exist, then they don't know that was exactly the same one.
Right. Or maybe that doesn't work, and you're just like, okay, yeah, that's fine. They work with the evil organization, but not enough that they would send them against a rival organization. That's okay. But this same dungeon that I built can also be used for were-rats, and there's a were-rat outbreak in the town.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so maybe like instead of describing it as like the building is described as being more run down or better kept, or like you throw some rugs on the floor and it's a house, it's a manor or whatever. But you know, one of the things that we definitely did a lot with making organized play adventures, where we were using maps that were pre-published, is coming up with ways to explain whatever is on the map in a new context. So I can tell you from that, there's a lot of ways to be like, hey, this map can work for this thing too.
Yep. Garland mentions questionnaires. Those are great for your players to learn about them. But you can also make leading questionnaires that can help get your players to do mostly exactly what you want in certain ways while giving them huge agency into it. So, like, if you give your players a questionnaire and one of the questions on your questionnaire is like, why have you joined, the Crimson Syndicate? Did you have something to hide? Are you running away from something? Or are you just in it for the profit?
Mm-hmm.
And then they get to answer that. They get to come up with whatever they want, but they can't write in... Or, like, even the players who usually try to, like, be like, oh, yeah, we're doing a thing where we're fighting a war against all hobgoblins? I'm playing a hobgoblin. Usually they won't write as an answer to a question like that, I'm not in the Crimson Syndicate. Why did you ask me that in this questionnaire? They might still give, like, a really ridiculous answer to that, which is what my unicorn fairy godmother told me, that the Crimson Syndicate is a great place to have tea parties. It's like, this makes no sense, but at least they admitted they were in the Crimson Syndicate, which normally would be difficult with this player. So, like...
And then you're like, okay, why did they believe that their unicorn fairy godmother told them that? Is their unicorn fairy godmother an illusion sent by someone in the Crimson Syndicate because their character is incredibly gullible?
And it's like, yes, and they call her the godmother of the organization. So, let's see. There's a question from the Mighty Phil, who said for their Monster Hunter theme game that they plan to run, they intend to make every monster a bigger threat, making it so you have to hunt it through 3 encounters. Kind of like in Monster Hunter, you're chasing it down, and then it runs off, and then you go back to its lair and have to fight it there. And then you gave additional rewards. I think you could absolutely do that, and you have the right instinct to think about giving it multiple rewards, because it essentially is equivalent to having to fight multiple instances of the creature, especially if it gets all its resources back in between each phase.
I would say that, like, given the complexity level of that, like, it probably would feel like a lot if every encounter does that, so it may be better to save that for, like, more important and bigger creatures that you're dealing with. And another thing that would be good for variety is to slightly change up the abilities with each phase. So, like, maybe the first time that you fight it, it's encased in a powerful armored shell, but the PCs break the armored shell. And then the next time that they fight it's faster. And then, like, ultimately it's faster. And then, like, the last time they revealed its molten core, and now it has, like, a fire breath.
And it's in its lair, and the fire from the molten core can trigger lava avalanches from around the lair.
So, like, having different powers and abilities, as well as different, like, hazards or terrain features or other companion creatures can really make it feel like you're working your way through. Especially if there's something that is a visual distinction on the creature that's like, all right, yes, clearly you've defeated it in some way.
That's right. So, the key with that, like Linda said, is also to make them feel like those first 2 victories are a victory, and not like a stolen victory that was, like, stolen away by box text of the monster escaping. So, by it losing its armor and leaving the armor behind, which maybe is now your first set of loot for it, that's a great way to feel like, okay, now that armor is gone, we've definitely got rid of that. That was a pain.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad that's gone. That is better in some ways than if it just runs off.
Yeah. Or maybe if it runs off, there's something that was a goal that it was trying to accomplish, or something it was doing that the PCs didn't like. Where it's like okay,
it's attacking the town.
It's attacking the town, and then you get it to run off quickly enough that you save the townsfolk and no one dies, and then you can go pursue it. But you've already achieved your objective of save people's lives.
The important thing when you're trying to create this recurring battle is to make the intermediate victories still feel like victories, even though they haven't really won all the way yet. And those are some good examples of how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So we gave some prep work do's that sort of came implied with prep work don'ts of like, don't do the thing that's the opposite of this do. So in addition to the don't of like, don't create tons of information about something you definitely will not need.
Mm-hmm. Another related one on that is that like, if you do find yourself creating more that's just for, like, your funsies and you're like, I'm entertained by thinking about what the socio-political structure of this kingdom would be or whatever, don't then, like, think that because you prepared it, you have to show it to the players.
Yes, that's right. You can find someone who's in part of an anarcho-syndicalist commune and refuses to acknowledge King Arthur because some watery tart lobbed a scimitar at him.
Yeah, and then it's like, yes, well, you can't progress until you listen to this 10-minute box text from this NPC explaining everything to you.
About the anarcho-syndicalist commune.
Yes.
Yes, there's no need to get all that information to the PCs. They're not going to remember it anyway. And if you quiz them on it later, they will get angry at you. So I would say that's definitely a good one. Another good prep work don't is if you can help it, and maybe you can't because you're going to have a schedule that you know is going to get really crunched soon, but you're free now. If you can help it, try not to prep that many sessions in advance for stuff that you know that you will eventually need, but you definitely won't need it this session. You'll need it like at some other session. Try not to, because of the fact that when the PCs do something unexpected and then you turn out not to need it, you're more likely to be correct about what you need for this session than you are in any session after that.
So when you are looking at that longer term prep, what's good to do is to think about it in terms of not like this is exactly what will happen, but major antagonist wants to do things A, B, and C in that order. And then you can go back to and revisit and be like, okay, now is the time that major antagonist did thing A. Now in this session is the time when they want to do thing B. Did that plan get changed by the PCs? So that way, instead of having like everything, it's very easy to update that kind of stuff, comparatively speaking.
That's right. And no matter how good the villain is at scheming, and even if you are a very, very crafty and good at manipulating the players into doing what you want, GM, there's going to be some things they do that you didn't account for, or even things that, even if they tried to do all the things that are exactly what you thought they would, there are going to be some die rolls that produce weirdo results that you could have never expected.
There's also another thing that you can feel a little safer in prepping are, I would say, kind of like the unavoidable challenges. Like if it's like, that, on this specific day there's going to be like
a meteor will fall from the sky and Godzilla comes out of it. No matter what.
Then or if there's something that's maybe not necessarily a challenge, but like this is guaranteed to be a thing where it's like the PCs are absolutely going to be somewhere in this country, and on this date in this country there is a giant festival.
Yep.
So you can like start putting in some thought to like what is that festival about, but still you wouldn't want to be like, and then they do this activity and this activity, because the PCs might be like, we've decided we hate festivals, we're gonna go dungeon
or they could be in jail during the festival, and the most you would get, even though you prepped a lot of the festival, is the guard being like, I can't believe it's Starshine Festival and I have to be here guarding you lousy arses for putting a badger into the bathhouse.
But it seems to be worth saying, like, prepping, like, okay, on this date, this is Starshine Festival. Major ways that people celebrate the Starshine Festival are C, D, and E.
I would have been out there celebrating the Starshine Festival by making a little star boat and putting it into the water, or making a kite of a shooting star through the sky, or putting wishes on a tree. Just like everybody else that I am now narrating what we have been doing so that I, the GM, can get out my frustration out of character, in character.
Yeah, no.
But now I'm here guarding you in this jail because you put a badger into the bathhouse.
Very kludgy way to do it. But I mean, you could still have it be like, yeah, you know, they see that when they come out or whatever, they see like the wish paper is still on the trees or...
And they see a little kid is taking down their wish paper after a few weeks. It said, "I wish that my hadn't been scarred for life by a badger going into the bathhouse."
Harsk, what are you doing?
Harsk is like, "I do what I want," and he sips his tea. He sips his tea. And they say, "No tea in jail, Harsk." And Harsk says, "I do what I want."
That's why you got here. Under the influence of tea.
Next time someone says they want to play a pre-gen Harsk, maybe instead of people being like, "Don't play Harsk, it's Harsk," just be like, "Sorry, he's in jail for sending his badger into a bathhouse." We have to pick a different pre-gen.
No one likes to smell of wet badger.
Oh yeah, I wish my daddy hadn't had to work as a guard and miss the festival.
Twist the knife, why don't you? You ruined the child's starshine. You should feel bad about yourself for deciding to, I don't know, whatever robbery you enacted. Or...
10 years later, an assassin tries to kill the PC, and they pull off the hood, and it's like this 17-year-old girl.
Like, who are you?
And it's like, who are you? And you don't remember me? You made my daddy miss the festival when I was 7 years old, and I still remember this because you put that badger into the bathhouse.
And then you're like, oh my gosh.
It's like, has this become your whole personality about this one festival? So yes, he later died because he caught a cold from being in the dungeons during the Starshine Festival, which he shouldn't have been in, and now I'm going to have my revenge.
Yes, and now she's the Starshine Killer.
Yes, the Starshine Killer.
There you go. Spitting A+ backstories.
Always
right
killing people on the Starshine Festival and pinning their body to the wish tree. Also, somehow all the badgers in the area were dead, and then they later find out she's after the PCs.
Yep.
Okay, so I gave some of the major prep work do's and don'ts that I wanted to give. Obviously, there's a lot more specifics you can go into when you know about your specific group, what they like, when you know about your specific idiom, your strengths and weaknesses in prep work. But I really do believe that the ideas we talked about are universal, except for the one that Linda and I disagree on, based on whether you should slightly over prep or slightly under prep.
So to go back to sort of like the what goes into the future, like one thing that I found worked really well for me when I was doing Kingmaker is having a calendar of the things that were definitively going to happen. So it was like, you know, major astronomical events or astrological events. You know, in fantasy they can kind of be intertwined. And like festivals and holidays and like, you know, and when like NPCs would be expected to reach certain stages of plans, and then I could be like, oh yeah, this is gonna happen here. And then it's easy to say, okay, well, I had my bank of events that could happen at any time, and I would be like, all right, I'm going to tentatively put them in this order. And then, if it was like, oh, well, the PCs did this kind of thing, so this event doesn't work well. Okay, great. I slide that to the next month. So it was good to have that in there for a sense of. And also, like, if you have things that are like, you know, the PC said farewell to the sailor, and she said that she would be back in 3 months in port, and they could discuss things again. And then, you know, that'll help you with, oh yeah, well, here's a reminder, in 3 months this character comes back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always good, and that's part of something we even talked about in the improvising episode, to make notes for your future self about something that you're going to need to pay attention to later. That's somewhat different than prep work if it's something that comes up in the moment, but it will also help you with your prep work because it will tell you that your past self was saying, hey, this is something you better prep.
Yeah. Well, it can, I think, intersect with prep work whenever you go back to your notes and you say, oh, well, I kind of told the players this thing was going to happen. I should make sure that I flush this out because it's, it's a thing that has been seen by the players, and so therefore it exists.
It's where improv becomes leading into prep rather than the other way around. It's a cycle. It's a loop that never ends, and they can interact in all sorts of ridiculous and beautiful ways.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that was mainly what I wanted to say on that topic.
All right. Awesome. So let's say
Thanks
goodbye
for
to
joining
YouTube.
us, everybody.
Bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye.